friends. We see a few new faces here. Can you hear me? Yes. First of all, how great is it that winter is over? This year has been insane, and I'm so glad that we were able to arrange it just in time for tonight's event. I wanted to just introduce the evening by talking a little bit about our film program, which we've been doing for about 9 years. Excited about it, and we're thrilled that through those years we've been working pretty actively with filmmaker Damian. When I learned that he was traveling to Ukraine, I invited him to show whatever footage he collects while he's over there. And when he returned, we were in touch, and so I'm very grateful that he was able to patch something together so quickly after his return. And you're getting to see some very, very fresh footage that he was able to record in Kyiv. So thank you, Damian, number one. And after Damian and I had agreed on this event, fortunately for us, Andrea Chalupa, who's been a big activist on Twitter and other social media, she's in the back there. Andrea put together a panel of experts who are going to be talking to you this evening. I haven't met them yet, but Mouaz Moustafa, star of Red Lines, an award-winning documentary about Syrian activists. I think that's probably a very important discussion that we're going to be having in comparison to what's going on in Ukraine. And Michael Weiss, if you're following any of the news from Ukraine, you've seen reports on the interpreter. So we're very glad to have him here tonight with us. Andrea will introduce them all a bit after the film. So the program is that Damian is going to talk about his film. We'll show the film. After the film, there will be a panel that Andrea will be moderating. So again, welcome, and thank you for coming. And I'd like to welcome Damian Kolodiy to this.
Thank you. So when Hanya initially asked me if I had any footage to show, I didn't really think I had anything that interesting to actually make an event. But on my last day, I did an interview that I think you guys will find really interesting. I just went for a week at the end of February. I went primarily for the commemoration of the Nebesna Sotnya. Those are the demonstrators that were killed on Maidan a year ago. So we're actually going to see 3 videos. I'm going to show the first one is going to be just a little highlight reel of the commemoration march that happened. People came to remember those that were killed. And the second video is going to be soldiers returning from Debaltseve. Debaltseve was where the Ukrainian soldiers were recently based, and they were surrounded, and they had to basically break out of an encirclement. So it was a really hazardous retreat. There were a lot of casualties. And I happened to, through some friends, be able to meet some of the buses that were literally coming back from the front line. The soldiers were coming back from the front line, and they were being greeted by both family and strangers who were just there to welcome them home and thank them for their duty. Both these, in Ukraine, there's a style in the news called bez commentary, which I really like, and it's just kind of raw footage, edited together without any commentary, without any logos, and I feel it gives you a chance to absorb what's happening in a little more detail, a little more depth. So these videos are edited in that same style. It just kind of gives you a couple moments to really appreciate what's going on, who are the people, and just kind of give, I feel like it gives you a sense, a little bit more of being there. So the first 2 videos are just short, those 2 shorts. And then the third video is a longer video. It's an interview with a wounded soldier in a hospital. He was injured at the end of January, and he'll tell you his story in a lot more detail. I found his story very, his account, I mean, just an incredible account. By all circumstances, he should have not been alive today. But to see his spirit and his passion that it's not broken, and also to hear his account of what life is like on the front line, to me was very moving, and I think valuable. And I wouldn't really call it a film, it's just more like a video testimony. So I want you, when you're looking at it, just think about it in the context of the information wars. What information is he presenting as an eyewitness and a participant from the front line? You know, he's not a politician, he's not press. There's a lot of disinformation from both sides. So I find what he has to say has more resonance and authenticity than some of the stuff you might be reading in the headlines. So think of it, of how this might be used as a tool, say in a congressional hearing or a war tribunal, or just putting it out there to people who aren't informed about what's going on. I think, and then after that, we'll have a discussion with our panelists, and I think we'll incorporate how maybe some of the information he's saying could be used towards that information. So, thank you for coming on this warm Wednesday, and hope you find this interesting.
So the panelists can join me up front. Damian, the filmmaker, we want to talk to you after that. There you are. And come on in, guys. Oh my goodness. So after that, all of you here tonight, Alexander is going to see the photos. We're going to email him the photos, and he's going to see that not only did he miraculously survive being run over by a Russian tank, but that all these people in New York City heard his story, and his story will travel, and we'll make sure other people hear it. So at least there's that after watching that, because I know we're all probably quite shaken after what we just saw. So obviously our panel was introduced when Tanya got the evening started. I'll just do a quick little refresher. Everybody knows Michael Weiss is the interpreter and the author of So good at the technology side of things. So Michael, of course, is the author of the Washington Post bestseller, ISIS, Inside the Army of Terror. He is covering all the hotspots right now in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. He's basically a living internet of foreign policy. We're very grateful to have him here. Then our other special guest is Mouaz Moustafa, who is the star of a chilling, heartbreaking, incredibly important film called Red Lines, which I watched, and I highly, highly recommend that you all watch it. Red Lines will take you behind the scenes of a humanitarian crisis and what really goes on in the establishment of these so-called peace organizations and how bureaucratic they are. And it really, it's very hard to watch this as a Ukrainian for obvious reasons, because Syria is, of course, a warning of where we could all be headed potentially if Ukraine doesn't get the help it needs. The filmmaker of this brilliant film, Red Lines, is in the audience. The filmmaker of this brilliant film, Red Lines, is in the audience tonight. Andrea, Kaylin, thank you, and Andrea, Kaylin. And I highly, highly, highly recommend the film. I was crying. I just gave him a huge hug as soon as he walked in the door. I'm like, I feel your pain. And then, of course, Damian, Kolodiy, and we're gonna start with you after that. So what was your motivation for whipping this whole event together like one day and making us all watch this?
Well, essentially after hearing this story, I just really wanted to do something. And, you know, it's like, how is this possible that this is going on and no one is doing anything about it here in the West or even the Ukrainian government? I mean, it's really it was distressing. And, so I wanted to share his story because I think it's an incredible story, but it's also inspiring to see that his spirit is still so strong. He still wants to go back and fight. And you know, these are like Ukraine's best guys that are going on the front line to die. A lot of them, and they shouldn't have to die. So it's kind of like, well, what can we do? We shouldn't just be sitting here and doing nothing. So that was kind of the motivation behind having this event and trying to have a discussion about what we here can do, what role we can play.
It was interesting in the touching footage of the people welcoming their soldiers home. But the thing that stood out was you didn't see anyone from the Ukraine's government welcoming them home. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I noticed that there was no official representative, there was no kind of military person or someone from the government. And then my friend Ivan, who kind of told me about that, came with me there, made this comment. That they're not needed for anyone except for their family. So there is this sense that these guys really aren't being taken care of or receiving the support that they need and they should, they're entitled to. So that was a little distressing that like these guys are just coming on the buses and they're going to the train station and I don't know, it seems like something's not quite the way it should be, ideally.
It's incredible when you have Alexander featured here. He's a bioengineer. He's just somebody that you can just sit with and just talk with. And then you'll look at some of Weiss's videos inside the DPR, and some of the Russian or the separatist soldiers they show look like absolute tweakers. Like they're on meth or something. And they're like, come look at this hostage Ukrainian soldier. So do you want to just comment on, because I know you watch a lot of the footage coming out of the war.
Well, certainly, again, I don't know how, there's a lot of hearsay in the information sphere, but my understanding is that a lot of the guys that are fighting, some of them perhaps, are being let out of jail, and they're saying you don't have to serve your prison term if you can go, if you'll go fight in Donbass from the Russian side. I mean, there's definitely a different demeanor and level of education and culture between the two, and that's been the case in those areas, I think, for a long time. I mean, I've gone to Donbass and Crimea once or twice before this conflict happened, and certainly you can see the difference in the people and the way they treated each other or communicated with each other. There was always this aggression where Ukrainians were a little more civil, I would say. And certainly Alexander, you can see he's very intelligent, and even in the way he describes his experiences, and the detail of the weapons used, and the movement of the infantry, and describing his own injuries. I mean, clearly he's a very intelligent person. And I think there's a lot of guys like him out there.
It's sort of sad where Ukraine's best and brightest are choosing to fight in the war, because as he said, it's our responsibility. So do you get a sense that the patriotism that's keeping the army alive on the front, given what they have to fight with? Do you see a lot of, when you were in the hospital, did you get a sense that these guys were like, we want to go back out there, get us back in, sort of thing?
Well, I didn't talk to too many guys, but my understanding is that what's really important to them is the letters they get from the kids. And you've probably seen that in some of the videos, either the Weiss videos or other videos, where they'll have paintings, from kids, drawings, and stuff like that. I think is what really keeps them out there and keeps them focused, and not just saying like, screw this, like why do I need to be here? And I don't have the tools to do this job properly. But it's the people that are supporting them, and they feel responsible towards supporting the people, and executing their responsibility, their oath, their obligation. But it's clearly dire circumstances.
So speaking of dire circumstances, let's move on now to Susan Rice. What are sort of your thoughts on what you could do with this video? And you were on Capitol Hill, you saw Newland, the Newland hearing. And so when having seen guys like him and then sitting in the bureaucratic torture chamber of the Congressional hearing, what was sort of your impression of that hearing?
So I went to two hearings. One was the Newland hearing in the House of Representatives, and one was Senator Ron Johnson, which was in the Senate. And his aide had contacted me asking for witnesses of Russian aggression. So this was the day after I filmed this interview, so I pulled some text from them and sent it to them. And they wanted to use it, they really liked it, but they wanted third-party verification because there was that instance where there was a tank, it was a Georgian tank from 2008 that was presented at a congressional hearing. So now there are a lot more, they want more verification about who he is and if he's legitimate. But I really got the sense from those two hearings that Congress overwhelmingly wants to do more to support Ukraine from both the Democratic and Republican side. And really, the bottleneck is the White House administration, the Obama administration. That was my sense that, you know, almost unilaterally, you know, people have some reservations, but everyone feels like the U.S. should be more involved. And it's, you know, being a person who was an Obama supporter, I volunteered for his campaign, and I voted for him twice. It's really frustrating to see that he's really kind of taking a passive role and not leading. You know, one of the things I was left with from the testimony of Saakashvili and Kasparov is that America needs to lead the way. You know, Europe's hesitant, but if America goes, that they will support the U.S. As they have traditionally. So he's not really doing that, and he's kind of acquiescing to Merkel and Holland. And, you know, it's unfortunate, and you know, I kind of want to know. I guess maybe we can talk about how can we reach. You know, it's hard to get a message to Obama, but his advisors maybe are a little more reachable.
So I'm going to open up to some people who've been there. And so could you talk a little bit about sort of what Ukrainians are up against? What are some of the doors that you had to really bang on? And if you watch Red Lines, you'll see this man just stalking the halls of Congress, stopping, you know, members and being like, hey, this humanitarian crisis, innocent children are dying in Syria. And what you do is just so, I was really, really incredibly moved by it. So if you can just sort of walk us through what your experience was like.
Sure. I mean, first of all, I was getting goosebumps the whole time I was watching this Ukrainian hero that's, you know, describing things that I've heard so many times, you know, regularly back and forth from the field and the border, and seeing these young men that are out there fighting for their freedom, for their right of self-determination, for their dignity. And just listening to the gentleman, you know, on the panel as well about the fact that, you know, I come also from a background where I, you know, worked as a field director for President Obama's campaign, donated for him, didn't vote on the second time, didn't vote for the other guy, but didn't vote either way because I was very frustrated with that. And so it's been a huge disappointment because that's not what we expected. You know, we expected leadership from someone who looked so promising when it came to these things. And unfortunately, in terms of the foreign policy, it's been a huge failure in terms of Ukraine, Syria, and other places. But what's really eye-opening is that it's the same struggle. It's the same victims, it's the same oppressors. And when the United Nations is impotent to act because the Russians are vetoing anything that has to do with this stuff, then it is the responsibility of the international community led by the United States to lead and to end this. You know, the allies of the Ukrainian people and the allies of Syria are supposedly the West and the free world. And all we get from them are impressive rhetoric and statements that continue all the time. But the allies in Russia, they support with weapons and they support with action all the time. And that's incredibly sort of depressing to watch at a country that we live in. And, you know, I consider myself an American in every sense of the word, that I believe in the values where our core values and morals, as well as our national interests, actually align on Ukraine, on Syria, and we watched as this administration, as he said, acquiesces to the Russians themselves, not just to their own allies, and it's incredibly unfortunate. So I just want to really thank you for letting me come here, and it's such an honor to be here, and I think that you know, as far as Ukraine and Syria, in terms of activists here on the ground, it's really the same cause. And the more that we can work together, the more that we could, you know, get more pressure on this administration, the United States government, to act. Unfortunately, and we should talk some more in terms of who to reach out to, in terms of policymakers and so on. But the president's very insular and cautious in the way that he's handled his foreign policy. And Michael can really go into more details on that. And it's been so hard to convince them. And I think the one way is, the hope that we have is that the American people, that the other parts of the U.S. government, like the United States Congress, are really places where we need to invest time, including also the media for public opinion and so on. Because as complex as our struggles are in Syria and in Ukraine and so on. And again, it is so eerily familiar every time I speak to a Ukrainian or to follow the news, how similar these situations are, although the range of destruction may be a little bit different. That you know, hopefully we can pressure enough to instill change, but we can't give up and we can't wait out 2 years, although we may have to. Sorry I didn't get into the experiences, but I'm just so passionate, I think, about your cause as well as ours, because it is really the same thing.
No, absolutely. I mean, over 200,000 people have been killed in the Syrian war, and nearly half the population is misplaced. And Assad, of course, we all know, is an ally of Putin. Putin's who's supplying him with all these weapons to murder his own people. So, Michael, doesn't it seem, and this is sort of the impression that I think a lot of people are now waking up to, it seems that Obama's trying to wean the world off of dependency on the United States as sort of the superhero that will just come in and fix problems. Could you comment on that?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, a few weeks ago, with respect to the Syria crisis, I was talking to a very senior State Department official who said the administration has one foreign policy objective for term 2. And he said it's rapprochement with Iran. Not a deal over the nuclear program, but bringing the Islamic Republic of Iran in from the cold. Well, from that follows several things. Number one, acquiescing to what is essentially Iran's takeover of the security forces and the military in Iraq. So we're all watching the TV about the Battle of Tikrit to flush ISIS out of Saddam Hussein's birthplace. The U.S. is completely absent from this. They're not providing air support. They're not providing any kind of consultation with the ground troops or intelligence sharing, so they say. This is an operation led by Qasem Soleimani, who is the commander of the Revolutionary Guard Corps' Quds Force, which is the foreign intelligence wing of the IRGC. Why is this important and how does this affect Syria? Well, we talk about the Assad regime in Syria. In effect, in reality, there's almost no regime left. The war in Syria is being waged by Iran. This is sort of the greatest kept secret of this whole conflict. Let me, by a show of hands here, we turn on the TV every day, and I go on CNN and I talk about ISIS because I wrote a book about them, but I always try to make this point. Is ISIS the only organization or the only entity in the Middle East that's burning people alive? By a show of hands, how many of you think that that's the truth of the case? Okay, good. You're way ahead of the curve, indeed. And much better than the White House, I have to say. There was a report that came out 2 weeks ago by the Syrian Network for Human Rights, and very much designed to push back against this idea that as barbaric and atrocious as ISIS is, it's by no means got a monopoly on human rights abuses or unfathomable imaginative sadism. People in Syria are locked in their homes, and the homes are set alight, and they are burnt alive inside their own houses. Who's doing it? Well, whatever's left of the Assad military, but a group called the National Defense Force. What is the National Defense Force? It is a wholly trained, wholly owned and operated subsidiary of the Islamic Republic of Iran. It is a consortium of militia groups bundled into one kind of umbrella, overseen, armed, trained by Qasem Soleimani, our de facto ally in Iraq. Okay, so just because it's not on the TV, just because it's not on the front page of the New York Times, doesn't mean it's not taking place. Does the administration know this is going on? I should hope so. I told the senior State Department official, these militia groups in both Syria and Iraq are committing atrocities that rival that of Daesh, which is the pejorative word everyone should use to describe ISIS. And I said, if the policy is rapprochement with Iran, does that mean essentially we're going to acquiesce to this and kind of either downplay or deny it's taking place? And he sort of inclined his head in my direction. And this is not somebody, he's not a bad man. And he travels through the Middle East and he tells me I meet with Arab officials and diplomats and they're all, I mean, they're chewing the carpet in frenzy and anxiety at what's taking place. You have essentially, in 2 countries now, the murder, the ethnic cleansing, and the dispossession of the Sunni Muslims. And if you think that we're going to win a war against an ultraist, takfiri, jihadi group like ISIS by alienating the one demographic you need to defeat a group like that, you've got another thing coming. This is not a strategy to defeat ISIS. This is public relations management. Just so we can get the deal with Iran and then kind of kick the can down the street, hand it off to the next president. With respect to Russia and Ukraine, I'll give you a little news scoop. Several weeks ago, I know for a fact, John McCain, good senator on both of these issues, met with the Vice President of the United States for lunch. And he said, Joe, I don't understand. Why aren't we sending weapons to Ukraine? And Joe said, there's only one man in this country who apparently thinks that's a really stupid idea. Guess who that is? And by the way, it's not just weapons. I mean, you should all know, Ukraine has a surplus on things like AK-47s and ammunition. I mean, I know it's Soviet era, but some of this stuff still works. What they need most of all, anti-tank missiles like javelins. They need surveillance drones, which apparently we're going to send them. We've just decided today that this is actually going to come through. We'll see if that happens. Even the non-lethal stuff that we have committed and promised has not come through. And this came to light this week during these hearings. Congress is grilling the administration. Why aren't you sending MREs and sleeping bags and all the stuff that you say that, you know, we owe the Ukrainian people? So look, there is a colossal failure across the board at all levels in terms of what U.S. foreign policy is doing now. I think there's a kind of, it's almost like everything is frozen in amber. And yes, part of this has to do with a kind of fundamental reappraisal. I mean, Obama promised to be a transformational president. He is, just not in the way I think that most of us were hoping. It's the idea that the United States does more harm than good when it gets involved in these conflicts. So we should de-escalate, we should hand it off to the Germans and the French, and indeed to the Iranians. A couple months ago, because everyone was worried that Article 5 of the NATO Charter would be violated by Russia. What happens if Putin sends tanks or separatists across the border into Narva, which is, you know, the Estonian city with the largest ethnic Russian population? This would violate Article 5. That would mean that all NATO countries have to go to war with Russia. He gave a blockbuster, beautiful speech, not seen since Ronald Reagan in terms of, you know, the inviolability of the Atlantic Alliance and, you know, the United States' you know, sovereign commitment to defend its allies. A few days later, he was at a fundraiser and he said, "We have no national interest in Ukraine." Which do you think is the more sincere sentiment there? I mean, not to sound too cynical, but you know, in 6 years of this stuff, I think we can all make an assessment. I take a very dire, very pessimistic view of the next 2 years. What's happening in Iraq is going to get worse. Today, in fact, ABC News released a blockbuster report showing that not just the Shia militia groups that are beholden and answerable to Iran, but even the US-trained Iraqi security forces are committing war crimes that equal the atrocities of Daesh. Throwing people out of buildings, cutting people's heads off, putting the severed heads on top of US-supplied Humvees and driving them through cities and towns. Okay? With respect to Ukraine, I'm of the belief at this point, Putin is not going to stop until he gets his land bridge. I think he wants to go the whole hog. He wants Mariupol. He might actually go for Odessa as well and try to connect to Transnistria. This apparently was the ultimate objective. The film quite rightly said the resistance of the Ukrainian people is something he did not calculate. You know, Russia has actually suffered major losses in this war. This is something else you're not seeing much of. It's coming out in drips and drabs. And Novaya Gazeta had a great piece of a Russian soldier who was completely burnt. I mean, 85% you know, of his skin was removed because he'd been hit by a tank shell. He's saying, I'm basically an unwilling executioner of a dirty, illegal war that my own country doesn't even acknowledge. And if you try to acknowledge it, I mean, mothers and wives of these dead soldiers are asking, where did my boys get killed? And the answer comes, they're not. If you try to protest, if you try to even call attention to the fact, you're going to be locked up. So what's happening inside Russia is incredibly scary. I mean, I'm talking to people all the time, particularly now after the Nemtsov murder. What's coming next? I mean, this reminds me of the Kirov assassination in 1934. You know, you perpetrate a crime like this, you find some patsy, blame it on them, and then you justify a massive crackdown on civil society, opposition, or anything that even hints of an independent, critical-minded, you know, civic activism. So we are in for some very dark times, and I wish I could convey better news about what's coming forward. I'll end it on one last note. I've likened the foreign policy or the U.S. position on everything to Alice in Wonderland. If you remember the character, the White Queen, she has this sort of paradoxical line about jam tomorrow and jam yesterday, but never ever jam today. This is kind of what I see in terms of their so-called strategic communication. So just one last example. The Wall Street Journal had an article a few weeks ago saying, well, we can't provide even the rebels that we're spending $500 million to train up exclusively to fight ISIS in Syria. We can't provide them air cover or protect them from their real enemy, the Assad regime, which is dropping barrel bombs and chlorine gas on their heads. Because if we do, the Shia militias that we have, quote, deconflicted with in Iraq are going to turn against the soldiers, the US soldiers we've sent to Iraq to train up the Iraqi security forces. So we're worried about that. This week, they say, well, maybe we can provide air support or protect these rebels we're training in Syria, but we have to find some legal justification for attacking Assad if that case. And John Kerry was asked, well, if we do, are you worried that these Shia militia groups in Iraq are going to turn on American soldiers? And he said, no, I've seen no indication of that. These are Khomeinist, anti-American jihadi groups. Terrorists, just Shia terrorists instead of Sunni terrorists. I've seen no indication that they're going to attack us. Again, so the other day it was, they might turn on us if we don't do what Iran says. And today it's, well, they're not. There's no indication they're going to harm us. Jam yesterday, jam tomorrow, never ever jam today. Just pay attention, because the rhetoric changes ever so slightly as the weeks and months go by. What they said yesterday is not going to be what they say tomorrow, and what they promise is not going to be delivered. I mean, Mouaz's film is called Red Lines. Where did that sentiment come from? Chemical weapons use, that's our red line, we're going to intervene. Well, no, you're not. Unbelievably small airstrikes on Assad. Well, that didn't happen. Now, there is no rapprochement or grand bargain with Iran. I don't really believe that either. So, I just wish I had better news to convey. It's just, everything I look at, everything I survey these days makes me more and more depressed. And I think the important thing, I will end on an optimistic note, because I don't want to send you all off in a suicidal mood. It is very, very important not to be cynical and not to sort of lose hope and say, that's it, throw up your hands, there's nothing we can do. There's always things you can do. You can pressure your representative, you can pressure your senator, you can raise a hue and cry and a big stink about what's taking place, and call them on their bullshit. I mean, the US government is lying. It is. Tell them, we know you're lying, we can prove it, here's the evidence for it. This is not about public relations when people's lives are at stake. This is not fun and games anymore. 200,000 in Syria, God knows how many in Iraq, how many thousand now in Ukraine? 6,000? The numbers are going to grow in the next 2 years. I mean, these jump exponentially. And we still, that's not even taking into account any other unforeseen crises that may erupt elsewhere in the world. So it is everybody's duty as a democratic citizen of this country to not give up and to keep rattling the cage.
I completely agree with you. The minute you start to despair, you forget that you actually can make a difference. And at the end of the day, if you watch Red Lines, you'll see when he's walking the halls of Congress and whatnot, you'll see that you're dealing with bureaucrats. When it's like 6 p.m., they check their watch, they're going to go home for dinner. Meanwhile, a civilian, Mouaz here, he becomes the revolutionary Syrian government by launching a civilian police force just to reassure Syrian refugees. He's showing the United States government intelligence from Syria that they don't even have. So that just shows you, it's like the power is actually in our hands, because it's us versus the bureaucrats and their indifference. Back to Putin and the Russian soldiers, I think that's a really interesting Achilles heel. Reuters came out with a report last week on how, Boris Nemtsov, he's been a thorn, obviously, in the Kremlin side for many years now. He's done, Russia's had these marches. They let these marches happen. Nothing changes. Everyone just goes home at the end of the day. But what's interesting about what Reuters released was that Nemtsov's big whistleblower piece was coming to him from this family of a Russian soldier. And so it sort of kind of put off the alarm that Nemtsov was murdered, not because of yet another smoking gun he was going to release, but more, I think, from reading this, to scare off the Russian soldiers, their families, from talking to people like Nemtsov. So it kind of goes to show that this is like a potential area where we could really hit Putin.
Well, I was in Kiev twice. The last time I was there, the most remarkable thing I heard, I mean, this was, the ATO was successful, and this is one of the reasons Putin sends in more material and more weapons and properly, quote-unquote, invaded. But the last time I was there, I was looking for anti-war sentiment. Are there any Ukrainians who think this is just a fool's bargain and something that we should give up on, cut a deal, and just be done with it to say? I couldn't find any, because the answer was, they said, look, we know we can't defeat Russia in a conventional war. That's not the purpose. The purpose is Putin is lying to his own people, and we are going to lead Russia. We are going to send home, what is it, cargo 200 body bags in the morgue in Russia. Everybody has a mama and a wife and brothers and sisters who are going to wonder, where did these guys get killed? So the goal is to foment a crisis inside Russia on the basis of this act of foreign adventurism. And remember, why is Putin concerned with Ukraine fundamentally? Because if it can happen in Maidan, it can happen in Moscow. Ukraine is the test case, it is the petri dish for everything he fears will take place in Russia. To keep Ukraine divided, to keep it destabilized, to keep it a failed state, means that he gets to control Russia in perpetuity. That's the goal. So it's not even, I mean, not to say that Ukraine is a sideshow or marginal, of course not. This is the issue. But to Putin it is. It's all about him, it's all about his own country. So keep that fear, keep that paranoia in his head going. Push, push, push.